Russia's invasion of Ukraine has provoked a humanitarian and economic crisis. The International Monetary Fund has joined other global organizations and governments in expressing support for the Ukrainian people and in mobilizing large sums of money to help mitigate the economic impact of the war. Well, Gita Gopinath is the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and she joins us now. Thanks for being with us on France 24 this evening. The International Monetary Fund has this week approved $1.4 billion in emergency funding for Ukraine. Tell us what that money will be used for.
It's a pleasure to join you. As everybody knows, there is a deep humanitarian crisis and economic crisis ongoing in Ukraine following the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And so we've seen a big hit to just basic food, medical supplies, and so on, in terms of, and also the ability of the government to do its regular administrative work. The $1.4 billion that our board approved and that has already been dispersed yesterday will be used by the Ukrainian authorities to meet their budgetary needs, their balance of payments needs, to be able to make medical supplies available, to get food, to get this general functioning of the government, to pay salaries and so on. So this is what they needed in terms of really rapid financing, and it's what we provided as quickly as we possibly could.
So those are some of the more pressing financial needs. Down the road, we know Ukraine will also face the huge cost of rebuilding, no matter what the outcome of the current crisis, because a lot of the country's basic infrastructure is being destroyed as we speak.
It's really unfortunate, yes. I mean, in addition to the huge loss in terms of human lives, the large amount of migration refugees, over 2 million at this point. There's been devastation of the physical infrastructure in Ukraine. And so building all of that up will involve a large amount of financing.
Neighbouring countries are also being affected. Poland and Moldova, for example, are seeing huge influxes of refugees. What financing might they need, and what progress has the IMF made in providing that?
Yes, we've recently received a request from the government of Moldova to increase our financing that we provide to them. So we are likely to see other countries come in. Indeed, in terms of the economic impact, countries that are in the neighborhood that have strong trade ties with Russia, that also are getting hit in terms of lower remittances that typically come out of Russia into these countries, are going to be very hard hit. I mean, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, countries that rely also on energy exports from Russia will get affected quite hard.
Now, over the last 3 weeks or so, the US, EU, and other allies have imposed significant sanctions on Russian leaders, businesses, financial institutions. What do we know about their impact, and do you think they are the most effective tools?
The sanctions on Russia have been unprecedented, and you've seen Russian financial assets and the Russian currency, the ruble, just get pummeled from these sanctions. We've seen a breakdown in the payment system in Russia, which is affecting their ability to trade with the rest of the world, including in terms of energy exports, where there isn't a full-out embargo on it at this point. So given what we're seeing on the ground right now, I mean, there will be a deep recession in Russia following the sanctions that we've seen.
So far, these sanctions have been mostly targeting Russia and its close ally, Belarus. Do you think a secondary round of measures targeting economies that are still supporting Moscow, or at least not condemning its actions, do you think that might be necessary?
I think at this point, the world certainly wants to move to a place where we are de-escalating and we're moving towards peace. I think that should be the priority. In terms of what could worsen the outlook, I would say the more, the near-term one is what happens with energy exports from Russia. So if there were to be, for instance, a ban on gas exports coming out of Russia, then that would have a serious effect on the economies of Europe that rely quite heavily on these imports. And through that, we would see spillovers to the rest of the world, because there are many countries, the US, there's Asia, that trade heavily with Europe, and they would get affected. I'd say all countries in the world right now are, in terms of a direct channel, are being hit by higher commodity prices, energy, food, semiconductor metals that go into semiconductors. These are the pieces that we're seeing around the world that's just leading to higher inflation everywhere.
How isolated has the Russian economy become, and how are the Russian people dealing with all this? Because, of course, although the idea is to discourage the military advances, we know that Russian households are really suffering the effects of some of these sanctions.
These are very deep sanctions, and you see that in terms of the amount of money that people can withdraw, in terms of the payment systems that are breaking down. Financial institutions in Russia have been heavily sanctioned, even though there's a carve out to those that are engaged in energy trade. It's a big hit. The ruble has collapsed, because of which, as the currency depreciates, you're seeing very high pass through to inflation. And the most recent numbers you can see are just very high levels of inflation. That's a big hit to real incomes in the country and to the cost of living.
Now, the global economy is now facing a double crisis, really. It's still emerging from the effects of the pandemic, now dealing with this huge conflict as well. The overall impact, of course, is going to depend in part on the outcome. But tell us what the IMF is forecasting in terms of the impact on global growth and recovery.
We will have those numbers in April when we put out the next edition of the World Economic Outlook. It's a fast-changing landscape. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of the impact, the deepest recession is very likely to be Russia, because that's where you're seeing the sanctions being hammered. And of course, in Ukraine, because that's where the war is happening. The next round of effect is on neighboring countries that have trade ties with the two countries. This includes, again, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Caucasus. But then if you look at the larger economies of the world, I would say that Europe is much more exposed to this war than is, say, the US or China in a direct way. What all countries around the world, of course, are facing is just higher cost of living. That's reducing real incomes of households, reducing their purchasing power. And that's going to have a negative impact on demand, but that could lead to we will certainly have a downgrade to our forecasts in April. The extent to which that happens, again, depends upon the developments over the next few weeks.
What about emerging markets? The IMF has today been focusing on the impact of this crisis on African economies. How exposed is the continent, and what sectors are especially vulnerable there?
So the African continent is hit in multiple ways. Firstly, in terms of the importance of energy and food in their consumption basket, is just much higher than for advanced economies. So when you have these prices going up, it has a much bigger effect on cost of living for people on the African continent. Now, countries that are energy exporters have an offsetting effect because they get higher revenues from their sales outside that they can use. But for most countries in Africa that are energy importers, and food importers, this is going to be a big hit. For the countries that also supply food, there's another channel through which they're getting affected, which is through fertilizer. Fertilizer prices are going up because Ukraine and Russia are important producers of fertilizers. So this is another channel. The second, of course, is the financial market channel, which is we're seeing borrowing costs in frontier markets rising quite sharply as there's risk-off, as there's uncertainty about where things are headed with respect to this war. And these are countries where already debt was at a precarious level for many of them. So that can push them over the edge. And that's another dimension in which they're getting affected.
What about the Middle East and Gulf states in particular? They have a lot of overlapping interests with Moscow because of their oil output. How are they being impacted?
So the ones that are exporters have the benefit of the increase in commodity prices and oil and gas prices. So that will help them through that channel. But again, in terms of general inflation in their economies, this would put pressure on inflation. These economies were recovering before this hit. Now this affects the speed of their recovery coming out. The countries that rely on tourism, let me give you the example of Egypt, for instance. Egypt is a country that relied on tourism coming out of Russia, that relied heavily on wheat exports coming out of Russia and Ukraine. So again, the hit to that country would be quite severe. It just varies depending upon the country and its trade relations.
The European Central Bank has today described this war as a watershed moment for Europe. Do you agree with that assessment? Is this going to reshape the global economy in the 21st century?
I mean, firstly, it was unthinkable that there would be such a war in the 21st century in Europe. And so, in that sense, it is a watershed moment. I would say that there will be lasting consequences of this for the global economy. I mean, quite simply, if you look at the energy sector and energy trade, it's already clear that that will look very different in the post-war landscape. Countries will diversify away from Russia. You know, there's a push towards more renewables, so things will change on the trade front there. The second, for instance, was on payment systems. I think after the sanctions and so on, you could see big shifts in the payment systems. You could see an acceleration, for instance, of digital currencies, CBDCs. So there is a lot going on. And the concern that you might be held hostage to exports from another country, I think is a major concern that's coming out of this crisis.
All right, Gita Gopinath, thank you so much for speaking to us on France 24 this evening.
Thank you.